Hi, Luck.
Hello, Tim. How are you doing?
Good. How you doing?
All well.
Good.
Planning to attend the one summit in person or
Uh, no. Actually, I had I'm on a cruise with my wife, so
okay.
you guys you guys have fun. I know I
Yeah.
will.
That's more important.
It is. We had that thing booked. Well, then I saw, the O&E summit came up. I go, oh no. And then it got worse when they said now we have Nephew Day. I go, oh.
Mm.
I go, oh well. I think I'd rather still remain married. I can just imagine, well, dear, we could cancel this because I got to go do this other thing. Yeah, that wouldn't have flew.
Doesn't work that way.
No,
So,
which is, to me, it's like, oh, come on, guys, give us, you know, we need time, right? You need at least, when you're doing these conferences, for people
yeah,
to schedule their lives, their schedules.
yeah,
You
absolutely.
need
I
to
mean,
be
yeah,
notified when it's going to be. You don't need to know what
mm,
it is, but you need to know
indeed.
at least
Yeah,
6 months, and then you
yeah.
know we have to
I
get a
mean,
little bit better.
especially when, yeah, I mean, you could have your personal reasons in place, like you and it, in almost every organization right now is like on a cost profitability kind of thing. So you need time to convince your bosses, like, yeah, I need to go and attend
Yes,
such meetings and conferences.
right.
So yeah.
Hey, Liam, we're back. Sorry, and we're still talking about my cruise.
Okay.
so, so when I took it over, when I said uh, uh, to Alexis that I would host it, I actually had it wrong in my calendar. I thought it was an hour before, so Lena and I were on for about
Yeah.
15 minutes just chatting about everything.
Uh, yeah,
There's
I got
Stefan. There's
confused with your IM on Slack. I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
is it?
my bad. My
Okay.
no, my bad. I was looking at my calendar that I put down, not the
Mm,
Nepio calendar.
mm.
Hello, Stefan
Hey,
here.
hey, Stefan.
That's okay.
So, hey, Stefan. So, Alexis won't be able to make it today.
Oh,
So I don't know if Wim can make it or not. So, but I think those were the two critical, or at least the most opinionated people that were in the meeting. So I wanted to make sure at least one of them were on there, right? So you could have
yeah.
a
Honestly, I think we need to have them both because this is really we need to have them agreeing because I feel we really should have them both
Mm.
here
Or we
because
could discuss
otherwise
it here and decide and move forward. We'll ask them to record it,
no,
to
it will
forward the recordings.
yeah we
Yeah,
need
that
to
won't
have
work.
kind of a consensus,
Yeah,
right? So we should
yeah,
have
yeah,
everyone.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Wim is driving this from. He wants to have, a way, and I think we all do. As a matter of fact, by the way, we want a way of having a Nepio cluster creation that can be used uh,
Yeah.
outside of ORAN, right? And so
Yeah.
that's the big conversation we have, and I think we have to have Wim for that conversation, right? And then we can circle that around with Alexis. It'd be best if they're
Yeah,
both
but
on there, right? But
yeah, but Tim, I mean, I don't mind to have like that kind of because Nephew is like not just aligning or talking with the ORAN, right? So
right,
it's much more bigger, or
right.
you could have more things scoping, right? But we are discussing the user stories in the context of the ORAN workgroup, right?
Well,
So
this is actually the design, right? So it's
mm,
gone beyond. So the user story is the user story, right? It's like the scope of the user story is okay. Now we're into the design, right? And that design is how do I apply the ORAN cluster creation user story using Nepio enablers, right? That utilize Nepio enablers, right? That's the integration piece. And
mm,
that's
Yeah.
where, and unfortunately, they didn't really have a good set of a mature uh, Nephew enablers for custom creation. Basically, I had Cappy. So we started with Cappy, right? And I said, okay, we'll integrate through Cappy. And they said, yeah, no, we really need to have a better way of doing this, right? And that's what they've been working on a lot, right? Is that says, okay, we're building up. This is why this is really part of a SIG automation question, right? Not really a network architecture or use case question. But
Yeah,
we're building,
implementation
we're
wise,
building up, we're building
absolutely.
up that design, right? You know, and that's where we're at. And WIM is on. So I'm going to let me just do the introduction here real quick. So this is the April 16th meeting for we're going to do the deep dive. We're going to continue the deep dive on the OCloud No Cluster template. Now we don't have Alexis on, but I do see WIM and I see Liam is on as certainly coming from more of the network automation perspective. So Stefan, you know, I think we can make some progress here, but whatever we do, we need to make sure that Alexis is looped in. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. So if you don't mind, I will keep track of the notes, and if you would share, we can start where we left off on the
And I'll be available just for the first hour. So just a note.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing and you take over. Wim, is that okay with you?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Ericsson updates. I will present here then. Just a moment. Share screen. Okay, can you see my screen now?
I can see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we might need to do some zooming in. So in the last meeting we had, we concluded that in our Nephew implementation, we should have a generic cluster claim CR. And the aim here is that one should then support the OTMS case, but also non-ORAN cluster creation use cases. This cluster claim CR will model the request to create a cluster. Here, okay, we can we make this interactive because here I have kind of made the conclusion that I'm not sure if we really covered in the last meeting. I have said here that while the current workload cluster CR will be used to model successfully deployed clusters and used as a target for NF deployments, is this a correct understanding? Because to me, I didn't really think that we captured. Now, when we have this cluster claim CR, what will be the role of the workload cluster CR?
Well, in my view, we need two. So what the workload cluster CR does today, in my view, is that it actually registers the cluster.
Yeah.
Whereas,
yes.
So in other words, the claim we don't really have. I mean, so the claim is a bit hidden today. The claim comes by instantiating a package variant.
Yeah.
Referencing the package that has the cluster copy kind, right? That's kind of our implicit claim, if you will, right? But there is no structure. So what we would do here, my view would be to, that's, by the way, this is a pattern not just for clusters, but in general, is that we make these, that each of our packages gets a kind of an API, a structured API. And in the case of cluster, it would be cluster claim. So it would be all claim CRs that have a structured input. And then the specialization or whoever does the variations of that package, that's the input that they typically use to do so. You see, and from the moment you have a structured context, you can do much more with stuff, right? So today there's a lot of implicit things, but so I would advocate that a package would get, let's call it a claim. Every package that we have gets kind of a claimish CR that we model. And then that is used to actually do the specialization and hydration and whatever you call it, using that input.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
and then the workload
And
cluster.
then you will still have a workload cluster CR. That one will not go away. It's not replacing it. That one has another
That's my view.
roles here in the created cluster. That was my understanding, at least.
Correct. So the workload cluster CR is kind of your registry that you wanted to have, right? Is that what it does today? It kind of registers the cluster. Hey, I created one. What we don't do at the moment, but that's yeah, that's something we also we have to first do all this identity stuff. Is there's no status reporting, right? So we kind of implicitly, so we imply a few attributes in it just to get our automation going, but we don't, like today we implicitly say there's MAC VLAN and IP VLAN and stuff like that, or Azure IOV, but it's basically all mimicked. That information.
Yeah, that should be more clear then. To what extent something from the cluster claim is injected into the workload cluster CR, or what is still, because you have some properties there, like as you say, then the CNI settings, this ETH0 Ethernet interface that is defined there. It's very little things right now, right? But will that still be changed, or do we extend that in some way in the workload cluster CR? That is something I think we need to further understand.
Yeah, so so my view there is also here. We should the problem is you have the same problem with the workload CR that you have with all the rest, right? You become like a massive big CR that has to entail everything, right? So I rather go for a mode where the workload cluster is a very basic CR that registers the cluster, but all the details you should get from surrounding CRs that are referencing the workload cluster as such.
Yeah, some sort of a meta CR again. Well, that's what you are.
Okay.
But talking about like these two
Otherwise-
CRs, like a little bit of the timelines, right? I mean, you get the cluster claim CR for the request when you create a cluster, and then which will trigger the package variant, I believe, right? And then that package variant will that triggers or creates this workload cluster CR? Is that the intent?
Wait, so the way it should work, I think, Alok, is that the variant basically does a reference to the package as well as creates the context. So in other words, when you create a package variant, you actually say this is the package, right? So so you basically reference the upstream package that you want to instantiate. And the cluster claim is kind of providing you the context of the parameters that are needed to give the right context to that package that you instantiate, such that you can then vary the package based on these parameters that you get as the input. So I see the cluster claim as the variance parameters that you're going to use to actually customize the package towards the needs of that claim that you have instantiated, and you vary it based on these parameters.
So let me ask you the way I understood it, because I tried to put this in a context. Currently in the Nephew workload cluster template, the kept package, there we only have the workload cluster CR today. My understanding now then would be that the cluster package template gets extended with this cluster claim CR, and there inside of the package it refers to the specific parameter CRDs that are applicable for this particular package then. So if you have a cluster 1 package for deploying with according to OTIMS properties, then you have a cluster claim CR. It refers to this OTIMS cluster parameters then. And then that one in itself defines the OTIMS things then. and both these two needs to be inside of the package. It's like it's not like one is outside and one is in. They are both in the same package with this for this parameter ref to work. Is that correct?
Wait, so what you need inside of the package potentially, right? So, but let's agree is the spec, right? The variance and the parameters of it cannot be in the package because otherwise you cannot vary the package, right? So in other words, that's what package variants do, right? So package variants in essence have two things that that are used. One is a reference to the package, right? A package variant, as well as it gives you the context. And the context in this case is the claim, the cluster claim, right? What the package should have, right? And whether it's inside of the package or we can get it outside, we still have to figure that out. But the spec or the schema behind the cluster claim should be known within that package that you have, right? So in other words, the schema to do validation and stuff like that, that should be you could either say it is in the package or we fetch it somewhere else, right? But let's assume for now that it's within the package because that schema will have to be used to do the validation and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the problem here I had was that we made a bit of a on the fly example in the last meeting. Alexei put this together, but this to me is actually more of the instance, right? Here you have actually now then the cluster template ref, the site ref, the other properties, everything is filled in here. But you need to have like this kind of, as you say, the template variant of this AutoIMS cluster parameters CRD. It needs to be here, and I was not able to detail that part in this presentation because I wasn't sure how it would look like in the cloud cluster template. I just copied what he had drawn here as actually the package deployment, and where everything has been parameterized and filled in. So I think we have a bit of a work to do here to understand what is part of the cluster template and what is coming as input. And I thought actually that even in the template you will still have the cluster claim and all the parameter refs still represented in the cluster template, because that is where you basically tell that this cluster needs input parameters from this AutoIMS clusters parameter. And in another one, it could be a kind of 5G core cluster parameters or something non-telco. But in that sense, I think this cluster claim structure, referring to whatever parameter refs, it needs to be in the template, right?
Yeah, so these are all possible values that someone could imaginally send down, right? It has to be there because you'll have to do the validation, right? You could also say that there could be a default. So let's make it simple, right? For now, let's say we have a cluster claim, right? That has a parameter ref with O2 IMS, okay?
Mm-hmm.
What you might do is you might have default values for these parameters, right? In that package. So in the package, you have, from my point of view, you need the schemas for the parameter refs, right? Because that's you need for validation. And you might have a default instance that if you instantiate a package, it's going to use these default values. Does that make sense?
So I think that this AutoIMS cluster parameters that one will still be super generic. That one is similar to this nfconfig CRD, right? Because this one in itself as a CRD, this one will just contain the config refs, a list of API versions objects then. And then even this one needs to somehow be a bit more specific under the hood than I think. If we call it AutoIMS cluster parameters, at least there should be one piece here that is always the same, and that is somehow the schema or the structure for that one should always follow the same principles with this having a parameter for the cluster template ref, a parameter for the site ref, and then some other properties. And then we allow it to have an array of additional CRDs then that can be like deployment specific.
I perceive this, Stefan, as a default. So this is your default that you use. If you do not get other input, that's what you use. Does that make sense?
I wouldn't call it the deep. I mean, for instance, we know that cluster template ref, that one is very specific for a particular package. That one is then, there we have a name for that template, and basically how that one is. So that one will always be locked in, and that one should not even be changed. But site ref, that one will always be instance specific. So for site ref, for instance, it doesn't really make any sense to even have a default, I think.
Yeah, but for example, what do you do if you do not get that information, right? So even today in Kept, we have that concept, right? So we kind of like, I think it's called example or something. We call it example. So when you instantiate it, the problem is when you run the pipeline and the parameter is not there, typically you want, most of the time you want something. That's what I call a default, right? It's maybe it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But
I have seen that. Yeah, okay. It could always be example site or something then.
something like
So
that,
you
yeah.
mean okay, yeah, that's fine. So you basically, all properties should have some sort of an example value then or something. Even if we know that they have to be changed. Or?
Yeah, correct. So it's
Maybe
kind of a default.
we can say something like these are the mandatory parameters that has to come from the SMO, right? And once these templates get rendered and being passed by the SMO, they have to provide these inputs, or until we have the parameterization supported for the create cluster use case, we should have these template artifacts as very much site specific. So these are the list of artifacts which are supported by a particular site, and that these are static entries within the internal CRDs. I mean, this could be the way forward for the time being.
Ideally, right? In my view, ideally, that's why I was referring to a schema, right? If you take an open API spec, right, you get all of this mandatory default, you get all of this, right? So that's why now we don't do that at the moment, right? So, but ideally, if you put a schema inside or all the schemas that you would expect, you basically get all the defaults for free, right? And all the mandatory items when you do this, when you get a CR and you validate it against OpenAPI thing, you actually check whether all the mandatory parameters are ready and whether and if there is no ready, there is a default, so you pick that, right? So that's the value I see from using a schema instead of a default value there. Okay, Vish, as it said.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought this up, Wim, about the Open API schema. Since the O2 IMS, I mean, this is, sorry, I'm asking like an UB question. So if it is has been answered before, this is only from education. Please excuse me for this. So there is already a published O2 IMS Open API spec, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So which is totally independent. Basically, it doesn't know whether it is OpenStack clusters underneath or whether it is Kubernetes clusters. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So which means when somebody is making a call, they wouldn't know until there is some adapter written that receives that to know that, oh yeah, I need to go act on a OpenShift cluster or a Kubernetes cluster, correct? That means there has to be some sort of a translation that has to happen from.
Well, that's
Yeah,
part
I mean,
of
that's
the
the
recipe bit,
intentions.
right?
Sorry?
Go ahead, Allah.
I mean, that's the intention, but today you're referring to the API spec. I mean, the provisioning, we don't have any stage 2, stage 3 things defined for the provisioning related use cases. But ultimately, as you said, that's the goal, that the request should be agnostic to whether it's an OpenStack cluster or a Kubernetes cluster that should be provisioned.
Okay.
But that's done. But that's done. But that's done. Let me just break in here. So, but that's done through the fact that the only thing from an O2 FOCOM perspective is what they will provide is the template to use. I need this type of template, right? And the site and the cluster, right? If they're going to well, they're creating a cluster and the site, right? And that's all they were going to provide. They were going to talk about doing parameterization of that you can, from the FOCOM, you can inject some other pieces of it. So for us, we have those aspects of it. We have a concept of a cluster. We call it a cluster claim, right? We make a cluster claim that looks like that request, just what he's got here, right? And so that that's our cluster request set, right? And so it's going to create a cluster claim. Now the IMS has got the cloud has got all that recipe information that it still needs to be able to hydrate. It has to be able to set up all the resources, right? Anyway.
Yeah, so the way I draw it then is that if we make in the nephew package, we have the cluster claim and the OTIMS cluster parameters and some sub parameters, CRDs there, that shall be parameterized. That is also then in the template. We could have like this, like a schema then to do the validation, but that is still following the generic nephew engine, so to say, of how to create a cluster based on a cluster claim. What I think we will need is that on top of this then, and this depends on what kind of API we are defining here then. As Alok said, the API for OTIMS provisioning is not done yet. So the indication, what we have been discussing is that instead of using for the provisioning portion, if instead of having that one just as a traditional REST API, JSON REST API, as this current inventory API looks like, we could actually make this cluster request API as KRM based then. So then we say that even when you are triggering the OTIMS cluster to be created, you would send down then a KRM or basically a CR for this cluster request. And that one just contains now then OTIMS related things. Here you don't see that you have nephew or something else under the hood. So you wouldn't see any nephew cluster claim CRs or so here. You would just have whatever is defined as part of the OTIMS CR. And that is where I think that the only thing we really need here is the template ref, the site ref, and then a very generic cluster template input structure that is like just YAML based. That in turn then would be the schema for this one would be defined then of the underlying CRDs that we have then, depending on if it is a nephew package, then it's defined by all the cluster claim sub CRDs. If it is something else, it needs to be defined based on that, the internal structure. But the importance is that, like from a FOCOM point of view, we just need to know how to fill in this cluster template input structure. So I think we would need a schema for this aggregated input then, to be somehow generated also.
I think Fish had his hand up first, I think.
Yeah. So this endpoint for the IMS provisioning, right? I'm just, again, trying to think. There could be multiple endpoints, I'm guessing, correct? Which means the FOCOM...
No. There's a single endpoint.
Okay.
Single
because
endpoint
I'm thinking in the context of, again, please excuse me if I'm coming across as being noise here. The reason I asked that question was the thinking if FOCOM is very similar to NFVO, it's got the intelligence to figure out that, hey, let me go poke this endpoint to make this request because I know it's actually a Kubernetes endpoint and it knows, it will know what to do there. I know I'm digging a little bit into the details here. So I was thinking that maybe the FOCOM has got that intelligence or the SMO has got that intelligence to be able to pick the endpoint it wants to go deploy.
Yes, and I mean you have IMS endpoints, right? I mean the way
but
we
there is only
think
one,
we draw it. Shall I show here? Yeah. I mean every OCloud will have its own endpoint, and then it's up to the OCloud vendors what is beneath that. You can have an OCloud that is dedicated for only Kubernetes cluster. So you have a OCloud with infrastructure resources, where you only deploy Kubernetes clusters. And then the O2IMS interface here, that is what it will offer then. Then you could have another OCloud where you could offer IaaS, or a mix or something then. Yeah. And then the IMS interface there would offer that. But it's still just one single, as you say, IMS endpoint. That one should be capable of supporting everything then that is like can be managed by that OCloud. Both Kubernetes and like Vim IaaS resources, or even bare metal provisioning or so. I mean, that is totally up to the internals then. But the idea of, I think, the O2IMS interface is that the cluster templates we talk about, they shall be capable of deploying any of these types of resources, or what they call like node clusters.
Okay. Thanks.
So,
Yes,
yeah.
my question was regarding the following. So what is the difference between the cluster claim and the cluster request?
So the as I see it, the cluster claim, if I got it right, the cluster claim with this parameter ref here. Oh no, I wanted to do a zoom again.
I was hoping
if you have this
this
parameter refs with this kind O2IMS cluster parameters, it refers to another structure in the package, right?
Yeah.
That is what you explained last time. That once you have these two in the package, this one is then referring to this one. Then the result will be end up with a cluster claim that looks like this. Is it correct? I thought you basically in the actual CR that you are creating here, you know, will aggregate things. So you have the cluster claim, then you have parameter ref, then beneath that one you will have this API version with kind so. And then inside of that one, you will have the config refs. So the final CR will look like this. You will not have 1, 2, 3, 4 CRs. You will have just one CR for the whole cluster claim.
Yes, but my question is, what does the upper one still do that is not done through the cluster claim?
Get you from the
This is
from the ORAN world, right? Which we have to do. We have to honor the interface with from the ORAN world into the Nepio.
Yeah.
So that's effectively what it's doing.
Okay, so I see. So this is the front end to the OCloud, and then the result is going to be
Nepio.
on the right. Okay, I see. Yeah. So,
Okay.
so basically the top one is the O2 representation and the lower one is the Nepio.
Yeah, if you go into core, you go into, maybe there's another infrastructure provisioning stuff for some IoT, that may very well look different, right? Because you're honoring.
Yeah. So if you have an IMS that is not based on Nepio, then this one should still be there. That one should look exactly the same with this cluster request. While this one would not be there. They would have their own like CRs or whatever, and they have another completely different mechanism. But they need to honor this one.
Yeah. Okay. So, but in other words, what's going to happen? So you get let's say there is a piece of software that lives in the Nepio cluster, right? Which is the O2IMS mediator, if you will.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
This
it
one.
gets the top thing, right? Then it will. What it actually should happen is it should create a cluster variant. A package variant, which refers to the package that you reference in the O2IMS somewhere, I think, right? So you will have a cluster template ref, right? So you will create a package variant using the cluster template ref from the O2IMS provisioning. And then it will, and in that package variant, you refer to the cluster claim, which is the lower one that is going to then instantiate it. And that's going to trigger the cluster ISO, the Nepio machinery to kick in and create the cluster, if you will, right?
That is what I meant when I said here, porch clone update apply. That basically what that means here is you create that package variant in order to trigger porch operator to do the cloning. I could call it just create package variant. I think that is basically what you need to do here, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, it's part of the package variant. It does the cloning and it does all that stuff for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah,
that is what I meant. So the package variant will refer to the template that has been referred here. Then it will take all this cluster template input that is just coming together here, and then it needs to then parameterize that information. So this OTIMS operator, it needs to have that understanding of how the content coming here from the cluster template input in this structure is then mapped into the config refs that are inside of this cluster 1 package.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the way
And I thought, sorry.
Yeah, so the way I was envisioning that is that typically your O2IMS anyhow knows the package, right? So the what we call the dry package, right? So ideally, the dry package, if it would contain the schemas of the various configs, you will be able to discover the ones that are there, and then you can mediate, right?
And my thinking was that when you talk about schemas here, it should not be like the way we then use config refs and CRDs then in Nephew to define them. It must be a bit of a more of an OTIMS abstraction here, right? So
We need to map.
whatever, you need to map it. So I was thinking that this whole cluster template input in itself could be defined as a schema file, and then each top level object here, workload cluster config, multis config, any kind, whatever instance, each of these ones would then be represented of the names of each of the config refs here, because we know that this one will always be in an OTIMS package. We will always have this OTIMS cluster parameters kind. And then that one will have this list of config refs, and then they can have names. Then this one has workload cluster config. This one is called multis config. Then we can have another one, and each of them could just be like the top level property then of this cluster template input array. Then. So
Yeah,
and then everything below that will be inside of the schema here.
Yeah, at the moment, you could represent it as a string, right? Because the attributes that we typically use is API version, kind, and namespace name, but namespace name is less relevant here, in my view. So we could.
Yeah, and I don't think we need it up here. I mean, if we can have, if we want to we have that property structure here because we want each config ref to be like a sub CR. Right, but in the cluster template input here, that doesn't need to shine through. I mean, because this is not purely handling the values.
Yeah, I'm just referring to the reference, right? So if the reference could be based on an API version, because if it could just be a name, right? Because it's not because we have 3 parameters that we cannot represent it as a string, if you see what I'm saying. Because even that's what I was suggesting for the cluster template ref. Today, Porch has this very specific way of naming it, right? And it's even like this, that the name is actually a hash. So there's a hash inside of the name.
Which name?
Cluster template ref, so the package reference. So if you go to Porch today, so the way the name of Porch is constructed.
Up on the cluster request.
Yeah, so in cluster request,
template ref.
Cluster template ref, right? You also
cluster, that one, yeah.
We need to also do a matching somehow. We need to map it somehow together, right? So it's a similar exercise as with these.
Yeah. So what we did when was on this is that what they're doing is they're just allowing it for being also non-Nephew. The Nephew, the Nephew reference would use the tuple that you're talking about, the triplet, right?
Yeah, I would just make it a string, right? And then depending on where you talk to, the string has a different...
we've already said that. Yeah, that is a string for sure, right? And then depending upon how you're using it, the string has meaning.
Yeah, and I was suggesting potentially to use the same mechanism for the other templates because then you have one mechanism for all.
And what he's suggesting is that on this one, Stefan, your cluster template input, maybe that should be those inputs where you have workload cluster config, maybe that ought to be just a ref, right?
I think today we said it's an object,
But-
right? And like
Yeah,
a cluster
right.
template input, and that will be an object, and it could be a list or a key value or so on and so forth, right? Or another CR, right?
So
Yeah,
Hello.
but ref to what? No, that is where I'm getting no.
So we're talking about workload
maybe-
cluster config, right?
Yeah,
Let's
so
take that one there.
here is
Yeah.
my mental model. What I was having in mind, Stefan, is the following, right? Let's say you, from the package, you can discover the schemas that are there, right? So in other words, you know the whole API structure on how what input parameters are there. And that would allow you to, so the reference would basically give you a reference to the schema that you pick up. And then you can do the schematic mapping from that reference that gives you the schema towards what the package is expecting. You see, so that was where I was trying to get towards from a mental.
And then what I say is that when we talk about schemas, we need to be careful here, because even the schemas here, if we have a schema for the cluster template input, that should be an AutoIMS schema then. It should not
that's your
be
world.
the CRDs down here, right? So we
Yes.
need to have a mapping of it.
Correct.
And
So,
my
but
thinking
somehow,
was,
so somehow they need to match somehow, right? So you need to do a mapping somehow. So I was suggesting maybe, although this is AutoIMS world, if you have a way to be able to figure out the schema that Nephew uses, right? Using that reference somehow, then that's how you look up the schema, and then you use the software to do the mapping, right? So, but okay, maybe
yeah.
come back.
So if we say each of these API version sections here in this config refs, there will be a kind that is like on the Nephew side that is defining the CRD for that config snippet, as I say. And then you have metadata name, and here you have workload cluster config. So that one identifies, okay, here we have like a configuration instance with some that is expecting some data. And then you have another kind with the name multis-config, and that one is expecting some data. So my thinking was that in the injection here under cluster template input, you basically have the same names. So workload cluster config, that name, it points to workload cluster config here. And
Okay,
multis-config here, it points to multis-config here. So that way it should be quite straightforward for this AutoIMS operator to just inject whatever is coming in the input to the applicable config refs CRDs.
I see. So you're saying something similar, but I would use the API version kind as such into it, plus maybe the name, because if we go for a schema approach, eventually the name will not be in the schema, right? So it's basically just going to be the API version kind that you're going to get you the schema. Not the
Is
name.
it okay? Perhaps it's okay, because I was thinking that a cluster template input, that is like an AutoIMS owned property. And then whatever is beneath here, it could always be template specific. So if we put, can see if I can update this on the fly. If what I understand what we would do then is basically that here we would basically say then API version colon
something like that. Yeah, correct. So something like kind or something kind, and then
and then how do you separate things then? Is it dot kind or how would you?
So
because it would be in an. It
so
should be. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So the way that today Kubernetes does it, right? API version is basically API is ... and then version, right? So what people typically do is, so API version is a ... right, for the group, then /version, right? And then what people typically do is .kind, .namespace, .name. But we have to come up with a structure somehow that is, so it's API version .kind .name. So, but we could come up with other schemas.
Then we have the kind of workload
Yeah, and then
cluster config, and then slash, and then the actual property in this case. Then that was workload cluster config. Okay. Okay. And then everything done here is whatever is then populated here. That is coming there then.
Yeah,
okay.
But
Yeah, I'm fine with it, because that should be okay as long as whoever shall fill this in eventually upstream then. They will get the schema for what is expected to be included here, and they need to also understand that what shall be. So here I have no problem of making things a bit that it is visible then, even if it is, because it's not an ambition that we shall not like do some sort of abstraction of whatever is here. This one is OTIME specific, and the content there can be implementation specific.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay. I can work a bit with that. I get your point. Yeah.
So
Bala has a
Stefan,
raised
hang
hand,
on.
but-
That's what I was going to get to. So Wim. All right. So it looks like we've got an approach here that seems reasonable to Stefan and Wim. Bala, you had a question or a comment?
Yes. So generic comment is like Stefan said, this particular cluster request API, I think that has to be very objective, because that has to support multiple environments, including Nephew, but not only Nephew, right? It has to support, for example, in commercial deployment tomorrow, the Red Hat, Wind River, AWS.
Effectively, this is what we would take back to ORAN and hopefully try to standardize.
Exactly right. So I think to Stefan's point, that particular area it has to be very, very objective, and it has to support multiple environments. So from that angle, I think that particular use case, also we need to consider other use cases also. For example, even how do we provide clusters into cloud environments? Will this particular method that we are going with, will it work there as well? So with that said, Stephen, I think you mentioned need to get into the details of cluster template input, etc. there, right? So have you thought about any particular way of, for example, any particular way of specifying the parameters? For example, in case of Nephew, right, we do not take the IP addresses externally because that's managed internally, but that may not be the case in every cloud environment. For example, in certain private clouds, those IP addresses could come from the SMO itself for a particular cluster. So what level of details are we going to put under those cluster template input? I mean, about ORAN world, what is the opinion? How the ORAN world is thinking?
They don't know. They
So-
don't know, by the way.
So today we don't support the parameterization, right? Just to answer very quickly, Bala's point, right? I mean, we don't have. It's the very simple request that we are catering in the ORAN today. That you just refer to your cluster template artifact, which is like cloud internal in the reference, and that's all, right? But once we are debating and discussing about how we can support the parameterization. And one way is just what we are discussing here is like the template input. But I think this makes an assumption, or we can, once we start discussing in ORAN, we need to bring it up, like to include these vendor-specific template inputs. There is a mechanism to parse those template artifacts and then provide those vendor-specific inputs accordingly, right? Because that is needed. Otherwise, SMO/WorkCom doesn't know like what all information that has to go in that request, because these are all vendor-specific inputs.
Exactly. It become vendor-specific, and I think that is fine as long as we can have a mechanism to communicate a schema for this piece. So if we say, that assuming that we have a package in Nephew that looks, or we have an example package up here that has the cluster claim, it refers to an OTIMS cluster parameters and then some sub things. We should be able to query for the schema for this structure. That should be a part of O2IMS support and in general, and even, I mean, in the nephew case, it would return a schema for this structure. In other case where you don't use nephew for IMS, it would return a schema for a different structure then. And then FOCOM basically needs to expose, based on the schema it has received, it needs to tell the SMO client then, or service orchestration within SMO and so on that. Yeah, in this particular OCloud, in this particular template, this is how the input schema looks like.
So in this particular, if we just take this approach, let's say somebody is creating a cluster in GCP. Can you explain, given that scenario, how does SMO provide this kind of a request?
So exactly. So then it depends on now then, what do you use here then in the GCP case? I know that we have done some integration in Ericsson towards the Google TNA APIs. And there, if I remember right now, then there you also have these blueprints. I mean, it's very oriented to I mean, I would say based on nephew thinking. So there they had setters files that they communicated. So we could actually query for the structure of that setters file in that case. So I was thinking about something similar here, that in the O2IMS standard, we actually basically we introduce some sort of a query API where we query for the blueprints or query for the templates. And when in that query response, that response would contain then a schema definition, JSON schema, for instance, for this cluster template input. And then in the GCP case, it would basically contain exactly then how you want it to be structured. Then, if it is either in this way, the nephew approach, or you have a completely own way, then the way that GCP or TNA would like to get the input. It could be completely vendor specific then.
So Stefan, yeah, sorry to chime in, but I think it's really, so that's why indeed I was advocating to have a schema inside of the package so that you can discover it, right? And then you know for that particular package what are the parameters that are referred to.
But when you say, that the schema will be a part of the package, isn't it so that the schema, if we go with this cluster claim approach, now I'm not in presentation mode, so I can go back to presentation mode, and then I can, if we have this structure with config refs here under, then the schema for this input properties will basically be extended based on how many such sub sections you have, right? So the final schema for all the input will be some sort of the aggregate of all these config rep APIs versions, right?
Yeah, so I think first of all, one clarification is that, let's say we have 4 config reps that this package supports, right? That doesn't mean you have to send all of them. Okay, you can only send 1, maybe 0, or all 4, right? So that's a choice you have, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first clarification. But yeah, so you would have the schema for each of them available, because the advantage. So why do I see that this might be interesting? Is first of all, the input that this package is expecting. Today we don't have any of this, right? So somewhere in your IMS mediator, you probably want to know, right? Or you can hard code it, but I think eventually we might. So just to give you back to the example, let's say we have a cluster of Google and we have a cluster of Red Hat, let's say, right? For example, the Google one doesn't support Multus. at the moment. I'm talking not about TNA, but GKE, right? The Red Hat does, right? So somewhere in the package, you probably might have one that does give you, could give you the fact that it supports motors and the other one doesn't, right? So as such, you can do something with this information in your mediator, if you see what I mean. We could try to hide some of these things as well, right? But at least you have a mechanism.
But William, do we need to do that for the first?
No, maybe not for the first release, right? I'm just
Okay.
talking. I'm talking my comments right now are more for the future. I don't know when, right? But
yeah.
But can I also ask, in the Nephew approach, when we have these config refs with CRs, we have a CR called workload cluster config. Isn't the schema for whatever you have here, I mean, that is defined by the kind, right? That is defined by the CRD in that case. Or do we need something in addition to the CRD in order to
when I talk about the
schema here? Yeah.
When I talk about the schema, I'm talking about the CRD, right? So
yeah. So you talk about the CRD, okay?
That's correct. So
yeah.
I talk in general terms of schema, but in the Nephew ways, it's CRDs, right?
Yeah. And my thinking is it possible if we have CRD based, we can say schemas for each subject section here, and then on the OTIMS level, you query for the package and they say, give me the schema for this cluster template input, and then we will basically render based on the CRDs that are referred in this package. You render the JSON variant, the JSON schema variant of that. You don't expose it. I mean, it is basically YAML here, right? So you can define a JSON schema for how this YAML structure shall look like.
Yeah, you can. That would be easy, right? Because it's actually, at the moment, YAML to JSON is easy, right? JSON is less easy, but yeah. So it would be if we put the CRDs into the package, you would get, YAML to JSON is it's like there's a library you call and you get it in JSON format, right?
So I think that should be possible then. And then it's more like, as long as the FOCOM side gets that JSON schema, then we will be able to generate it according to exactly the way that the IMS, underlying IMS, needs it. And really the schema will then define which parts that shall just be copy pasted. So like this structure APIs, we don't need to interpret that part. We only interpret the particular values beneath that are required by the schema to be provided as input, and everything else is just copied from the schema and injected.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. That's the advantage that I see, is that you have a programmatic way to do the mapping potentially.
Yeah. So are we good with this? Then I think here we have a way forward for the creation phase. We need to unpack things and perhaps be more detailed on how the template looks like versus the package instance, and draw some sequence diagrams, how this mapping is expected to be working and so. But on high level, I think we are good, right?
I believe so. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. Next. You've got about, I'm gonna make it, look, guys, it's an hour in, so we got one more hour. So
we have one more hour.
Yeah.
Which one?
Yeah. Question on that. So when you talked about the cluster request is the open API spec, right? At some point of time, will you also show what the payload will look like? You know, the payload structure, which is generic, right? At that point of time, is that also planned?
You mean the payload for this?
Yes.
For the cluster request here. So I think that the payload, I mean, this is basically, for now at least, it's just the Kubernetes API. So the payload will follow the Kubernetes principles then. So this post on the API endpoint here will just contain a JSON version of this. content.
I see. Because I'm still in my mind, I'm thinking I'm somebody who has got both OpenStack and OpenShift or Kubernetes. So when you're modeling it, when you're abstracting it, I was thinking if that gets published now or later, or if you'll be looking at it from that angle, so that we don't have to rework it, right, for later. That's what I'm thinking in my head.
We can add it here. I think we can add some of those examples, perhaps in sequence diagrams, so where we really show exactly how it will look like over the wire, and then how that is stored.
Well, let's be careful.
So Vish,
Hang on, Vish, just a second. Let's be careful with this, right? Remember, I don't have to have everything. That there's an expectation that people will utilize the artifacts that come out. So I don't need to have everything documented on a slide down to the schema. Okay. So Stefan, don't think you have to do that. Ultimately, they'll be able to pull the APIs from the GitHub and utilize that. I just want to make sure that you're not doing more than you need to be done, right? And then redoing it again when you actually have to do the implementation.
Yeah, no, you are right. We can also go for implementation. I mean, we should soon be there, I think, to start with really implementing something.
So I think if I were to read Vish's question, Vish, this is not going to be the same API for OpenStack and Kubernetes, if that is the intent of your question.
Yeah, that post thing, that is generic. Actually, if you look at it, right, it's APIs,
the
O2 IMS provisioning ORAN.org. It doesn't say anywhere when I read through that URL.
No, let me say the inventory APIs for today that is published in the stage 3, they are very generic. Whereas the cluster provisioning APIs will be specific to a particular workload environment. So it will be different for OpenStack and OpenStack and Kubernetes. I just wanted to.
Well, hang on. I don't know if we're there yet, right? Because I don't think that's the case. Put your thing back up there. Don't even look at that. There's no provisioning API.
Yes.
The point is, if you look at this down below, where he's got his cluster request, it's got a client of a cluster request, right? So that API should be fair if you're doing cloud native with a CRD passing.
Yes.
That should be independent of OpenShift or whatever. Right?
Yes.
No. I mean, what I mean to say is OpenStack and Kubernetes. OpenStack can
but wait, OpenStack should be independent there also. This is the IMS, right? So the IMS should be able to support creation of clusters or Kubernetes clusters. It should be able to support OpenStack VIMs, but the IMS interface here should still look the same, right? It's not an OpenStack interface. This is the IMS interface we talk about here.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was saying. That is why I was asking, will there be like, hey, a draft?
It should be the same,
Will there be like a draft payload?
That's the challenge. So hang on. So Vish, that's the challenge that you're going to have, right? Is that we're going to do this right now. We're going to make this look like, just what you're seeing here. If that doesn't work in 3 different versions, then that's going to be, that's on this API. We'll have to figure out how to resolve that. The intention would be that I could use a cloud native CRD and any implementation underneath that would work, right? Okay. And so that's all I got to say about that.
And also naming here then. I mean, cluster request, that is generic. It's not like a Kubernetes cluster. I mean, in O2 IMS, in the inventory model, they have a node cluster, right? That can be either a Kubernetes cluster or an OpenStack Vim or some other type of clustering of nodes.
Can I ask a follow-up question? In other words, just for my own understanding, when will the Open API spec with the body be defined? Will it come at a later stage, basically?
Yeah. He'll define those pieces of it as he starts his implementation. What I'm trying to say. We're just getting to the point where we can get to the point where we can define that stuff. We're trying to get.
So we want to use, hey, let's see how it works on Kubernetes, and then work our way up for other things later. I see.
Yeah.
The nephew part is kind of very similar to NF deployment.
Again,
below.
We should separate it when you say works for Kubernetes. I think that the proposal we have now with a KRM-based API here is that the IMS management cluster will always expose a Kubernetes API as the front end. Even when you are managing Vim, OpenStack Vims, the management interface will be Kubernetes based. Always.
And the payload is KRM basically, but it's a REST call, right? So the payload is
Yeah, but that is already in Kubernetes.
Now,
So
in all honesty, I expect
Helm is always using REST to send things.
I think we are slightly on a slippery slope by making assumption. I think let's not even bring OpenStack into the conversation because that will lead to more confusion.
Yeah,
when I look at it from ORAN, I'm looking at, I mean, I know I'm working on Nephew, I'm working on OpenShift now, but I've worked in OpenStack in the past. When I look at ORAN is generic, basically, right? So
ORAN is generic, but not everything is generic, Vishwa. Because, for example, if you see the O2 DMS specification, there's a K8s profile for that. So basically, if you look at the O2 DMS,
but hold it, Bala, hang on. You're
that's exactly.
Maybe I don't.
Can I finish? Can you let me finish, please?
Go ahead.
Yeah. This is exactly the reason why I'm saying let's not bring in OpenStack into the discussion, because that will be only slippery slope. And let's just focus on what we have today for what we have now for the K8s, Kubernetes, and Nephew. I think that's where I'm getting to.
Okay. We can continue. I have another slide I really would like to get your feedback on, Nordan. So we jump to this one, if it's okay. The way I see it is that we also need to have a way of communicating back to Focom what is actually being done here. So, I mean, that is also a part of like the O2IMS APIs that I think, even if we can wait with some things for later, I think really these things would be some sort of a minimum effort to handle in some way. So my thinking was that this O2IMS operator then in the IMS cluster will need to monitor some internal resources. For instance, if it is via the cluster claim or via something else, where you can communicate the ready state of this claim then. So if you have some internal logic that is consuming the information in the cluster claim and doing the creation and even this bootstrap deployment of things and so on, and then at some point in time you have deemed that now I am finished with this cluster claim, it has fulfilled this purpose, it should be possible to put that one in a ready state. And in that case, the O2IMS operator should also put the O2IMS cluster request in a ready state. And there I was thinking that when you do that, the O2IMS operator shall also create this node cluster CR and the deployment manager CR. And we discussed that last time, whether this is really CRs or if it is a database entry or something. But I think that for now, I think we can go with CRs. I think it's even something potentially we could try to lobby into ORAN and see if it succeeds. But at least for this Nephew implementation, I think these two could be represented as custom resources. And then Focom then would monitor the cluster request. When that one is done, that is an indication that it should be able to fetch also the node cluster and the deployment manager CRs.
Yeah. So maybe, Stefan, my view here is the following, right? So we have to do the same thing as we did for mapping O2IMS to Nephew and vice versa, right? My proposal for the Nephew side would be to use the workload cluster CR, right? In which we will add the ready state, okay? So in other words, I see the workload cluster as the CR that basically gives us registration information, right? And on which we report the ready state. One of the challenges that we have inside of Kubernetes at the moment, so there is some efforts ongoing around that, but it's related to this, is that today getting a status in Red Hat and in TNA, they're all having their own mechanisms. Okay, so that's the challenge we have in Nephew. I mean, we're trying to help do that, and you have the same problem in O2 IMS, right? So so we have a generic issue, right? That's not only true for cluster, but it's across the board. Okay. So what is the mechanism? I am advocating, like you basically alluded to here, is that you have a single indication that aggregates all that information up. But that's a discussion in the Kubernetes community at the moment. So this is how far it is. But I'm also of the opinion that we should agree on a single condition called the ready condition that everybody should implement. And that is basically an aggregated information on the status of the cluster, right? Now, so my proposal here would be from the Nephew side is that we were discussing the workload cluster CR, right? So in other words, you get the cluster claim, right? So we get a claim. We will instantiate the cluster. We will also get an inventory object, or what I call registration, or whatever you call it, right? So in somewhere in the database, we basically say, hey, there was a workload cluster available. And that CR would get a status being the ready state, as you suggested, that you then pick up and you can report towards the FOCOM side. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the cluster claim, would that not have any such ready state, or would you have like a different ready state for the cluster claim?
The cluster claim basically says, so the cluster claim ready state, from my point of view, is basically saying, hey, I could handle your request. I fulfilled it, right? Now it triggered a bunch of stuff that is going to instantiate the cluster creation, right? And we then need to report upon that, right? So for me, I see that as two distinct processes. One is the ready state is that, hey, I could do what you have asked me to do. So I basically declare myself ready. And then the other one is really the cluster is ready. The cluster is operationally up.
Yeah, because I put them both in this previous slide. I skipped through that one, but this is basically just a bit of mimicking what is already done today then in Nephew. But here we have the cluster claim CR that is basically receiving the request. Then you would have the workload cluster CR where you then can track the registration process then.
And also the status. So at the moment, so we do not do that at the moment. So that's something we have to do. But when in the Bootstrap controller, I do, for example. So in KPI,
do you update the workload cluster CR, you mean, in the Bootstrap controller?
No, I don't, but we could do that. I mean, we have to define a mechanism to do it, but what I'm trying to get to is that for Red Hat OpenShift versus KPI versus Google, there all will be this difference. So, right?
So what is the cluster Bootstrap controller picking up before? How does the cluster Bootstrap controller know today that it can start with its deployment of all these management staging?
So in KPI, so it's only working for KPI right now. So there is various resources that I track, but KPI has a status that reflects its readiness. And that's the one that I'm using to declare, to basically go and transact. And if that's not set, I will not try to even install anything.
Right. So that mechanism also we need to consider how in the IMS case, how will that one be made a bit more multi-infrastructure supporting, right? Yeah.
My suggestion, Stefan, is the following: is to use the workload cluster, the registration, as that abstract CR that is basically abstracting Red Hat and Google and Wind River and whomever, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So in other words, what is going to happen? You get a cluster request, right, in O2 IMS plugin, right? Then you mediate towards, so you're going to instantiate a package variant with a cluster claim, right?
Yeah.
That's, let's say we have fulfilled so we basically process it and it's ready, it's ongoing, right? So in the meantime, you will have a workload cluster CR that we create in the cluster, in the management cluster, right? As you suggest.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah,
would
yes,
call it
yes, yes.
not node cluster, but workload cluster, or we can change the name, right? You call it. No, I don't know.
This is the OTIMS stuff, so we should keep
Okay,
them.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I was thinking here, basically, you would need to have both. So you should have, okay, I can add that later. But if we have a cluster claim, you will have still the workload cluster CR as well here. That is then,
Okay.
and then you monitor the status. So I can add that. And then basically the bootstrap controller, that one would need to update the workload cluster CR with status.
Yes, so someone, whether it's the bootstrap cluster, we have to discuss, right? But someone will update the status, and you should look at the ready condition being true of indicating it's ready, right? And that would be an abstracted interface that we should then implement across all the various cluster vendors.
Okay.
As a way to do it, but we will have to probably create special plugins for each of these vendors to accomplish that.
So then, in order to then report data up into this AutoIMS stuff here, cluster request and creating these node clusters, so this AutoIMS operator would actually only need to monitor the workload cluster CR. It wouldn't monitor the cluster claim CR.
Correct. Yeah, it would monitor the cluster claim because it might be that you're that somewhere we got an error with the parameters that you have, right? So it's
Okay. So
so you will probably have to do both, in my view, right? So you basically say, did my request fulfill, right? If that is true, then you should see a workload cluster CR once it's true, and then you will get the status from there.
You will have both then. I will clean this up, but I will just put it here so I remember. So here you have the other one.
Yeah, because I would like to use, so we also have the case where we just do registration without provisioning, right? So I would use the workload cluster as that vehicle for doing that. So you have one and the same vehicle, whether you instantiate the creation or whether we do the registration. So it's always workload cluster on which you would hook up to, if that makes sense.
So Wim, that is going to be like when you provide that request and when it kicks off, it might be a long running task, right? Which means the initial state of the status will of course be different than later when you try to get the poll for that state. And then also, since it's a REST call that is going to be made, there's this any off condition that you can actually, I've written some open API specs back about 5 years back, wherein you can actually specify either or a bunch of different options out, right? So wouldn't that be sufficient for actually looking at which state, looking at the...
See, I think this is a problem we have in Kubernetes, by the way. So we did a very good job for configuration, right? Making an API version kind and blah, 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 right? So, and then you have, but what we did not do is to say, I create a resource, right? And here we talk about the cluster, but it's the same for a network function, right? What is the mechanism that we all adhere to report it's okay? That we do not have, right? So, and that's why we are suggesting, so this is a theme inside of the Kubernetes community, by the way. So more and more people start to ask for this.
Okay.
So to basically ask, so we have this concept of conditions, right? And a condition have a status, right? Whether it's true or false. So if it's true, it's good. So in this case, it's good. You have a message, you have a region, you have a timestamp, and so these are the vehicle that Kubernetes, as a community in general, if you look to all the CR implementation, I would say that 70 to 80% you'll see this pattern, if not more, right?
Yeah. The status and conditions, yes.
Yeah, correct. So that's a generic theme that is basically being adopted. What we haven't adopted is a common mechanism to say it's okay, because some people use different reasoning or condition types versus other people. So there is no unified implementation or strategy around the usage of conditions, right? But this is something that we should start doing inside of Nevio, but also we should actually follow Kubernetes. But there is a trend to use that ready condition type as a vehicle to do so. And I believe we should follow that because that's a very good thing. And I start implementing it as we speak, right?
So basically, when this adapter will read this condition before it returns back to the REST API with the appropriate return code.
Yes, but for example, what will happen is this condition will change. So I would basically implement a watch on that condition, on that CR, and report upon the status changes, right? Because you will get an update every time there is a change, right? So you don't have to poll, but you can basically get a watch, so you get an event every time there is a change, right? Because this could be taking for, depending on the cluster, could be a few minutes, right?
Yeah. And if it's a bare metal cluster, it can be longer. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm optimistic.
Correct.
It could be many minutes.
Yes, yes.
But
because in my mind, I was like, when you're talking about this, I was really trying to. Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, so just real quick, just to make sure that you know, Stefan, is that you're going to have to provide a notification function, right? The NFO above, just what they're talking about. So you're going to get a status change on the request, on the cluster request, right? That it's been fulfilled, right? That's what it's ready context is. So we're expecting the FOCOM to do an NFO or to do a poll. Okay, all right, that's fine. That's
yeah.
just
I think we are expecting a polling here. No, we have also talked internally ourselves. I think we can just have like a polling mechanism or like a watcher mechanism.
Yeah, that's fine until they form up the notification.
Yeah, whether you do polling or event driven is an implementation choice at the end of the day, right? I'm an eventing guy, so I prefer events because it's less resource intensive, but it's more complicated to implement. But
yeah, but for us on that O2 web, it's just that we'll wait for the ORAN to because they've got special procedures and all that other crap, right?
I think we can start with a polling.
Yeah. It's an implementation detail. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
What's the most important is the common agreement on the principle of reporting status. I think that's the most important part.
Yeah. Then no, we have still some other questions on this.
No, I was just before what Tim was saying. I want to just say that in my head, the way I'm mapping some of these things work that we are doing is ultimately we have these use cases, right? And then we are trying to do this mapping here. Finally, we'll publish open API spec, correct? That for ORAN, and either what we return, what the payload for the post REST function is, or the return payload for the get function is, it gets mapped there, correct? That is the end goal.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is why in my questions are based on the ultimate thing, like, hey, when we actually go off and provide the get, depending on the vendors, different vendors or different distributions, the Open API definitely does provide for ways to say the variability of the response, what it could be, in terms of status and all that stuff. And how it gets mapped will probably be the implementation detail, seems like, by whichever adapter does that.
Yeah, but if we agree on again this KRM based, then this get on node cluster, then it will basically return this kind with status conditions specified exactly this way. Then the KRM based. So FOCOM would need to understand that structure.
The adapter would need to understand that and translate it to what exactly the FOCOM wants, right? At that point of time.
Yeah. So that is what I have in the coming slides then, because the after this now then, if we are good with this, now I have moved over to how would FOCOM look like? I mean, we have an incoming cluster deployment request northbound in FOCOM also. And no,
hold up, Stefan. Just a second. I'm
Yeah.
going for consensus, right? So Bala, did you have your hand raised? Did you have a question first?
No, I was going to make a comment on the event-based stuff, right? For example, the inventory API, right? That is required. If there is any change in the infrastructure, then the event that gets generated, that's part of a inventory event specification already
Yeah.
which is already in stage 3. So if a cluster, when indeed it gets generated, since it is a change in the inventory that cloud is managing, I think that will take care of that.
It will. We talked about this before, Bala. It will take care of that once we get
Only,
this, but we haven't reported inventory. So there might
exactly.
be some stuff that we're
Only
gonna have to
problem
do.
is if there is error. Yeah, if there's
Yeah,
an
yeah.
error, if the cluster doesn't get created, then probably
But
we'll have
then the request will never be fulfilled. It'll never be ready. It'll always be an indication of an error, right? It's an unfulfilled request.
yeah.
Yeah. So you
Yeah.
have the subscriptions here in the inventory case. I was thinking that in this release, no, what we are aiming for here, what we said was that we are not doing any inventory discovery or inventory subscription in this time frame. So that is why I said that we limit this discovery, so-called polling here, to only check for the node cluster and no underlying resources, no mapping to the actual compute resources or anything that we need. You only show the node cluster here in this time frame. Then later we need to do complete inventory discovery and associate the resources to the node cluster and so on. But that would be later, I think.
Yeah, that's a reasonable approach. Yeah.
Okay, so what we're saying, I'm making sure is that, based on what we've talked about before, is strictly what's happening in the IMS, either in the management cluster or in the workload cluster. I think, do we have consensus that we've got that pretty well nailed down, framed up? It's the best way.
Yeah.
Certainly not nailed down because of the implementation hasn't happened. All right. So I don't hear any yapping that says there's still things to discuss there. Okay, so we can go talk about FOCOM now. Go ahead.
So we only have half an hour. I don't know how far we will get here. But here I have a number of considerations then. One part, we talk about inventory then. As I see it then, we have a prerequisite here that FOCOM needs to know about the target O-clouds. So if we have, going back to this high level picture, so we have an IMS interface here, one here, and one here. So FOCOM, at least, even in this time frame, we need to know about those IMS endpoints. So even if we are not doing an inventory API discovery, I think we need to at least have some piece of this O-Cloud registration user story ready for R3 already. And I don't know if I'm running ahead here, but at least we need something like an O-Cloud CR that we are creating here on the FOCOM side. And so that would be the minimum thing I think we need as a part of this O-Cloud registration already now, that we create this one, and then we can have the endpoint URI address and the authentication secret reference for how to authenticate. And this information then needs to be injected and provided to whatever southbound, if we going back to this picture again, then to this like southbound, if it is copy or if it is something else, you need to provide the endpoint information and the credentials. So we need to fetch it from somewhere.
Yeah,
That's fair.
Stefan, for Netio itself, to instantiate the old cloud cluster is the same as we do for an ORAN cluster, from my point of view. So for us, there's not going to be a difference. What needs to happen, I think, as far as I understand, is that we need to, as soon as so there will be a piece of software, which is the IMS software, right? That we need to instantiate on the O-Cloud cluster, right? From the moment that is up, you should use that API, because you're going to have your own REST endpoint, I'm assuming, or are you going to use the Kubernetes and API server for it? or you basically spin up your own REST endpoint in the cloud cluster.
What do you think? I thought that for now, initially here, going back to those, we take this picture. Initially here, we could just spin this up with the normal Kubernetes APIs, the Kubernetes API server then. Just the way you do for ports today, right? I think we could do the same here.
Yeah, but then
Creating
if
this
you
cluster
do,
request, yeah.
if you do so, yeah, wait, so the thing is the following. From the moment you use the API server of Kubernetes, right, you are tied to the semantics of it, right? So in other words, you have to do KRM and blah, 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 right? So whereas if you
but that's why when you're registering to the FOCOM what the endpoint is, it can be the Kubernetes API server. For Nepio, that's what I thought so. I thought we were just extending the API server. The endpoint would be that O2 IMS operator, right? So that's what we're going to just show. FOCOM just needs an endpoint that he can communicate with.
Yeah, but then you are then you're going to be tying yourself to the Kubernetes API. So that means your FOCOM to the cloud will be, then it's not going to be a generic interface anymore. It's going to be Kubernetes because you'll have to have a different instantiation. If you're going OpenStack, you will have a very different means.
The URL will be different, right?
But even the semantics, because
we need to decouple the IMS interface for managing things and what we actually want to create, right? So in my view, then the IMS interface can be common and it can be KRM based for everything. And then beneath, under the hood, you are sending down a request, and in that this KRM based, again, then to either create a Kubernetes cluster or create an OpenStack VM or so. I mean, the KRM is just defining the payload, how you are defining the request.
Yeah, but if you use the API server of Kubernetes, you're also defining the API semantics, by the way. That's where I was getting towards.
Yeah.
I think
but
so.
Is that, we say we want to have it KRM based. So sorry.
Yeah, but there is a difference between being the payload versus the semantics of the API. There's a difference, in my view. The payload, I think we were all fine. Just to give you a sense, if you would deploy on a VMware cluster as an cloud, or you would deploy on OpenStack, you will have a different semantic. Is that okay?
I think Wim, my understanding is again, it's based on whatever I read so far. There are certain aspects of the API specifications in ORAN that is common, and at some point of time, they are separate for either a VM-based environments versus the cloud native environments, because finding the common denominator for every environment is not going to do any justice. For example, that's exactly the reason. That's the reason I was going to. For example, if you look at the O2 DMS interface, that's where I was getting to when I was talking to Tim. It has a very Kubernetes specific inputs because there's a KH profile to deploy workloads specifically onto Kubernetes environments. So at that point of time, for example, NFO part of SMO needs to know what exactly it is deploying and where exactly it is deploying. So certain aspects of ORAN's specifications are uniform, such as inventory, alarm API, things like that. But certain aspects of it's very environment specific, which in my view is it's absolutely okay thing to do, because finding the common denominator across environment is going to be self-defeating.
So perhaps I am optimistic, but in my view, I will say that those differences will be completely handled by the cloud cluster template. So it will be not visible to the SMO.
Basically, I think what I'm trying to say with, if you do this, that means, right, that if you would deploy in VMware, right, which let's say VMware outside of Kubernetes or OpenStack, you will have to spin up a Kubernetes API server. That's basically
Yeah.
the consequence. Is that okay?
Yeah, that is basically what I am proposing here.
Yeah, but a full-blown API server, right? Not
Is
just
that a problem? I mean,
No,
actually, what we say here is I mean, if we follow the Nephew, we shall have a full-blown Nephew layer on top of VMware, right? If we shall have that as a front end. Alternatively, they at least minimum they would like to have their own operator and Kubernetes API server. Then. Yeah.
But it means that basically your O2 IMS, that basically what you're actually saying, I think, is that O Cloud has to be Kubernetes.
The IMS.
Yes, the IMS interface has to be Kubernetes based. I'm fine. I'm just wanting
Whoa,
to make
whoa, 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 whoa!
that
Post of the IMS interface that they're talking about has to be Kubernetes based.
But
There's still going to be WIM, just to let you know. There's still going to be a RESTful other.
Yeah, but no. So Tim, you're not understanding what I'm saying, right? Because if you say a RESTful, then you're not going to use Kubernetes, in my view. Because here is the thing: if I would pick a piece of software, your O2 mediator, right, and I build my own REST API server, right, that is specified into O2 IMS, I would spin it up in Kubernetes, I would spin it up in VMware, and the FOCOM doesn't see a difference.
Yeah,
in this case, fair. In this case, if you would tie yourself to Kubernetes API server, you would have to spin up a full-blown API server and all the parameters and etcd and the whole enchilada in VMware and so on. Whereas otherwise, you just spin up the piece of software, irrespective of which API you're going to use. And that's the difference, in my view. And I'm not saying which one we should, we should pick one, but I want to make sure that everybody understands the consequences.
So I think you perhaps need to explain that then, because I don't really see the consequences. I mean, perhaps we need to go back to this. How will this look like over the wire or something then? Because
an API server,
yeah,
an API server of Kubernetes basically lists. You have to do a get. You have to implement a get. You have to implement a list. You have to implement a watch. You have to implement a create, an update, and a delete. And the semantics of the API are defined. And that's what you have to follow. Right? And you have no choice. That's it.
Yeah.
So that's the consequence. So all the way that list options are done, all the semantics of that API is defined by the Kubernetes system, and you'll have to implement. So in other words, the REST, it's not just a REST endpoint, but it's also the semantics of how that API is consumed, how you do a get, how you do a post, how you do, all of these parameters are predefined, and you will have to follow the semantics of that completely without any freedom. There is some freedom if you want to extend to other, let's say, other sub-resources and stuff like that, but that's the consequence. And I'm fine doing that, but I just want everybody to realize what the consequences are.
Yeah. So I raise my hand. So from what I know, if you are defining REST APIs in ORAN, right? In general, like how we have the post, that URI there, it takes a payload, right? The payload will differ. Basically, what the schema for the payload looks like for Kubernetes can be different than what is for OpenStack. That is probably what the profile means, right? That is what I'm thinking.
I don't really follow why we make a differentiation between Kubernetes and OpenStack. Again, then we should not have this based on what you are targeting to create, right? So when you say OpenStack node, then is it like the IMS is somehow based on OpenStack, or because it should not be related to the workload, if the workload is a Vim or a Kubernetes. It's about how are we implementing the IMS system, right?
Yeah, so Stefan, just to give you another example, right? If we take the payload, right, that we are talking about so far, right, and I think we have an agreement on that, I could basically implement a gRPC server that uses that payload as my schema, right? So the only thing it does it, but all the semantics of the RPC server that I expose, I have full control of, right? That's the difference. And you could basically build your own REST endpoint and define all the semantics on how your REST endpoint looks like full freedom. Whereas if you use the Kubernetes system, you will have a very specific, you're tied to the ecosystem. I believe it's a very good API design, right? So I like it personally, but I just wanted you to be aware of the consequences.
So my concern is more on the FOCOM side. I mean, FOCOM should be able to have a well-defined way to send this. If we start with, we agree on it's KRM based, so the structure is defined. I mean, we know we shall send the payload is agreed on. There should be a well-defined way for FOCOM to send this down. And my thought was that basically this endpoint that I talked about, when we have this IMS endpoint URI here, that endpoint URI could then, perhaps in my optimistic view, then it could be just the Kubernetes API endpoint. It could be also be some sort of a higher level endpoint still carrying this Kubernetes payload. But FOCOM could work the same way, independent on. Or do you mean that FOCOM also needs to have awareness of the semantics there in terms of?
Yes.
Today, yeah. I mean,
if you pick Kubernetes, right, you will have to follow the Kubernetes semantics.
Yeah.
So Stefan, just to add to that, for example, right, SMO, there are two components. NFO. NFO today, if NFO were to deploy workloads onto Kubernetes clusters versus OpenStack clusters, do you think, what do you think? I mean, do you think it does know or it doesn't know? It has to know, right? Because, for example,
that is the difference. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes,
it's
there is a
totally
difference. So, so from the NFO perspective, it is also a major SMO component. It's different. But I completely understand what you're trying to get here. It is workable, just like the way you said. If every IMS is implemented on top of Kubernetes, internally that could be managing either a workload cluster, workload based on OpenStack, or workload based on Kubernetes, that's fine. But the IMS is implemented on top of Kubernetes. In other words, IMS is a Kubernetes service. At which point of time, whatever you're suggesting absolutely works fine. So technically it's workable, but the practical consideration I'm thinking is, for example, if you look at OSC today, they have an implementation of SMO, which is based on for OpenStack, based off of Tacker, which is an orchestration platform that's for OpenStack. So they have very widely different semantics in terms of how they identify an OpenStack cluster. There is a concept of Vim. There is a concept of those are basically Tosca concepts. So that's what they're using as a reference implementation. What I'm trying to get to is, in the OpenStack world, they may natively identify and define things in a slightly different way than what Kubernetes does. And hence, we may have that impedance mismatch. But with that said, technically, what you're suggesting can work. I'm not against that, but most likely we may have some practical pushbacks.
Hey guys, so when I just pulled up the ORAN TR for the cloud native, the K8s IMS interface, right? So there's a section in there that they talked about and gave a proposal for the K8 interface, right? And so it basically goes along the lines of what we're talking about here, but it effectively says, and I think we go back and we look at that again, and maybe Alexis might be the best person for that. But it said, communication between FOCOM and the IMS via the O2 interface, whether employing a RESTful API like the one specified in the O2 IMS inventory service, or using CRDs, which is what you're talking about, as proposed in this section for the O2 IMS provisioning service, necessitates a single set of credentials for the consumer FOCOM. This ensures. So they're allowing as part of they're suggesting here, and they actually gave an API right for it, right? They're suggesting to utilize ensure the API name complies. So they're trying to align the API names with the format of the Kubernetes server, right? It looks like, and they have two different data models, one for JSON. But look at that section. Talk with Alexis about it because he wrote that piece of it, and then I think we can probably at least come with a proposal. But I think what you're looking at was the proposal that was coming out of that. That was coming out of that TR.
Yes.
If that makes sense. Okay.
I have no problem, by the way, about it, but it might mean that the O2 cloud will all be Kubernetes based, right? Which is I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I think the other thing, Wim, actually, that's this particular discussion we want obviously will be in the ORAN O2 groups. I know, I'm pretty sure Stephen and Tim are the leaders there. It'll be a very passionate discussions there. But in this particular forum, where is Nephew, right? We only need to care about Kubernetes, right? And that's where I was trying to get.
I will also follow up on our side, because even the Ericsson OMC, Operation Management Center, that is actually implementing the IMS functionality in the Ericsson case. I mean, it is not Kubernetes based in that sense. They have some mechanism internally, like, of course, where things, and it's running in the Kubernetes management cluster, but they did not have the intention necessarily to expose this as the native Kubernetes API. But when we discussed it, they say that it's not a problem. We could still carry, it could still be a KRM payload, right? And then still we can have another. The concern I have now, what I understand, that I haven't fully understood, is that FOCOM still needs to behave differently. I thought that basically the difference was that you have another API endpoint, and then you still provide the same payload. But what you say is that even with this payload well defined, there are still some tweaks and changes. It's not only the API endpoint that differs. It's actually something more in this request.
Of course,
Kubernetes is still REST API based. You can still make REST API calls on Kubernetes endpoints. So
yeah, that's correct. But there was
Stephen, my point was, it is a practical pushback we may get from the OpenStack community, because right now they're using very Tosca native concepts for the orchestration purposes. So technically, I think the solution that you're proposing will work. I think it will work. I'm more worried about the practical existing deployments, how they take this. But technically, I think whatever your solution you're proposing, it should work.
Do you think that the payload, will they have problem, because this is not Tosca node, and it's like a KRM YAML structure, right?
I don't see a problem.
Will they have problem even with the payload, or is it still just the semantics of the API?
See, the way you have to look at it, the difference it's very black and white that I say it, right? So you could basically build an IMS implementation with your own API server, from which you define your own semantics. You have full control, and you spin it up in Kubernetes, right? So, and what you now have to do, so the reason why I was going down, because FOCOM needs to discover, right? You could build your own discovery mechanisms, right? You use Console, or there's a gazillion amount of tools out there that do something like that, right? That basically tell you when you're ready, and you have full freedom of what you do, versus having to put that piece of software. And by the way, that piece of software, you can run OpenStack, VMware, all the same. There's no difference from a FOCOM point of view. Because you basically have defined all the API semantics that you want. Okay, now, so that's one option. The other option is you use the Kubernetes model, in which case, if you would deploy in OpenStack and VMware and whatsoever, you need a Kubernetes API server with you that defines the semantics. So that's the two differences. Now,
but they already plan on WIM, just to let you know, like an ORAN for the deployment piece of it. They already plan on using the K8s API, so it's already going to be there.
Yeah, but that's for O2 DMS, right? So I'm talking about, because we are talking about the cluster API should be, I should be flexible to deploy OpenStack, VMware, any cluster. It should be agnostic, right? So that's
Yeah.
what we are talking about. So of course, if you deploy a Kubernetes cluster at the workload level, of course you have to talk to the Kubernetes API. But if you deploy an OpenStack cloud, you will have to talk OpenStack, right? It
Yeah,
will
but
be
again, we mix about like deploying workload into that OpenStack view,
yeah, correct. So that's a
and here
different.
the IMS, the interface of the IMS, right?
Yeah, correct.
The
So,
IMS can still be common.
yeah. Now, so irrespective, let's say the question is then, is the IMS layer or the the O cloud layer, can we unify it to Kubernetes? I would love to do so personally, but I'm not sure whether the community will agree to that. But irrespective of that, we were discussing a registration, or how do we know that the thing runs, right? I think that's what we were getting towards, I believe.
Yeah, but yeah, we are coming back to how will FOCOM know how to construct this message. So the way I see it then is that either if you can agree with the community then to actually use the Kubernetes API and the Kubernetes semantics, I don't think that our own colleagues in Ericsson will like that. That is my understanding. They have some concern there. Alternatively, we need to actually then design on some way to tell FOCOM that, okay, this IMS is using the Kubernetes semantics, this other IMS is using some other type of semantics. And that is making me concerned, because then we don't have any more a standard O2 IMS API that always look the same.
The payload can be the same, but the semantics will be different. Yeah, correct.
That is my concern. So there I almost think that in that case, we should either really agree on having the Kubernetes API semantics, or say that, yeah, this is another O2 IMS REST interface, and where you can still carry a KRM based payload, but it is more of a well-defined REST API than how you are sending it in. That is not necessarily now than the Kubernetes API.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so this
right,
is
but
we have a bit of a road to take. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I've documented, because we've got about 7 minutes. I documented that as an issue that I think if you could take it up with Alexis. Alexis wrote that TR, so he would have an opinion on the approach to go there.
Yes, okay? Yeah, and I will follow it up internally again and try to be more specific with our guys.
Okay.
To really get that input.
All right, so you only have about 7 minutes to go. So what else is pressing that you?
Yeah, no, we go back to this one then.
I have a question on that, on the comment you made. Stefano, when you said, right, so as long as the REST API that URI is generic, right, depending on the payload, it can be context based. The implementation should be able to take care of determining, whether it is a payload for Kubernetes or anything else. So just want to
well again, this payload should always be the same. It should be the cluster request kind, and the cluster request kind is a CRD, and it defines these 3 parameters. And if we can identify some more parameters that are needed, like when you create an OpenStack Vim, you would need to have something more than these 3. We should identify that then, and then that should still be part of the cluster request. It could still be an optional parameter that is only applicable for the cluster request when you are creating an OpenStack Vim. But it should still be part of this kind. It's the same CRD.
Yeah, I still see that this maps to an open API spec. If I were to rate except that people familiar with Kubernetes will recognize this, but to Bala's point, there might be pushback too. Hey, what is this? Who are purists on OpenStack? But it still follows some of the open API principles here, right?
I wonder how we explain it.
Except it's more biased towards Kubernetes, that's all.
Yeah, they are all open API, right? I mean, even Kubernetes is open API based.
Yeah, exactly. Except that it is like for people who have seen this, who have worked with Kubernetes, they'll be like familiar with it and happy with it. And people who are new to Kubernetes, they'll be like, yeah, wondering. I mean, as long as to them it appears that it is open API, spec compliant, I think it should be good. Is what my personal feeling is. Yeah.
But for me, the payload as such, yeah, okay, there might be resistance, but I mean, any payload you can transport over any REST endpoint, right? So that's one thing that I think
But isn't it also like the thinking here to make this? It is a declarative resource, right? You really would like to follow the declarative approach. FOCOM creates this cluster request here, and then later it will monitor the cluster request in order for the status of it.
Yeah.
That is, yeah. If we now follow, yeah.
But the declarative, you don't need KRM for declarative necessarily, but you get it because it's defined like that, right? So that's the.
So compared to a normal REST API, it would almost be some sort of a create order or a cluster creation order or something, and then you get an order ID back that you can then monitor later then and see the status on that one.
You could still
if you lift it up on one level up on more of a traditional REST approach, or
you could implement the declarative let's say consumption of an API yourself, right? But of course you have to
Hey guys,
around that.
We are running out of time.
Yeah, so we've only got about 3 minutes to go. So the question is that we're at the FOCOM stage, right?
Yeah, we will.
So do we want to have another, I could ask Alexis to schedule another meeting. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Tim, is it worth to figure out whether the community agrees on Kubernetes or not? Because I believe the mechanism might differ. Because on one end, you are discovering, if we really talk about discovery of FOCOM, this question, or the answer to the question will be important in my view.
Okay, so we could take that question back up to the ORAN integration team and because there's FOCOM people there as well, right? So yeah, okay. So what I'll do is I'll document that and we'll take that up as a question, right? And just as a question, and try to do that next Wednesday. So my question, so that would mean that we wouldn't be able to have a discussion next Tuesday. Is there something that's not around that piece of it that you need to have?
We can bring up that question already tomorrow, right? About what.
Oh, Tuesday, this Wednesday. Yeah, I can.
Yeah. We have a Wednesday tomorrow. That's good, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry about that. I could try to put something together for that, right? Take a discussion
Yeah.
So for this, do you guys want to try to have the same type of meeting next Tuesday at this same time, same channel, same station?
It works for me.
Yeah, my only problem is that I have now a conflict at 5. So at the beginning, the first hour, I have a conflict now, which just came in.
We can sync with Alexis then, and then perhaps we take it later next.
What we can do is we can sync with Alexis at 10, and then you can come in an hour later.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So what I'm going to do is suggest to Alexis is to make a meeting for same time next Tuesday, right? And then I'll take the question for the API question to the ORAN group tomorrow, right? And I'll try to put a couple slides together to try to express the problem, right? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Okay. Have a good day. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Tim and Steven, really appreciate both of your patience and leadership here. I know it's a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions. I think you guys are doing a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all the feedback. This is
+1.
Hey guys, I like the fact that we're just getting this straight first. That's the big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Later.
Thanks a lot.
So you guys are all going to be at the One Summit, so we can see you all.
I'm not going. I'm taking my wife on a cruise, but I think everyone else will be there.
You mentioned
Yeah, I will not be able to go, but yeah.
Okay.
All right. Talk to you guys later.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah, bye.